Well, that definitely wasn't the plan. It was a plan, and we thought it might be possible, but on the information we'd seen from the sprint race, it actually seemed the less likely thing.
Hi, I'm Jodie, and welcome back to the Akkodis Race Debrief, where we're joined by Shov answering your questions from the Chinese Grand Prix. So, Shov, it's great to have you back for the race debriefs, and good to have you back in the UK. I guess you've not long landed back from China.
I got back yesterday, a few meetings, and this is the first full day back in the office.
I'm going to say you must look like you're feeling refreshed and ready to go.
To be honest, it's been a nice start to the year, so there's a lot of excitement. Good to begin with 2 podiums, and yeah, we're all looking forward to getting on with the rest of it.
Yeah, a great start, 2 podiums under the belt now. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. But first of all, a question from one of our viewers. For sprint qualifying, was the original plan to do 2 laps on the soft tyre? And if not, why did we go out so early, knowing that track times were only going to get better?
Well, it does stem from that decision to do 2 laps. And what we actually said was, let's carry fuel for a banker lap. So that's to say that if they had an issue at turn 1, turn 2, and we had been struggling a bit with a lack of rear stability there. So the drivers would turn in, they'd get a snap of oversteer, and then the car would slide, and that would more or less spoil the lap. So we carried a bit more fuel so that if that happened, there was an opportunity to back out of it and go again. Now, if everyone else is going to do 1 lap, and you're going to do 2, logically, you're going to have to go before them. So that decision does also affect when you run, because if you were to do, to do the second lap, you've got to make sure there's enough time in the session. And coupled to that, McLaren decided to do a 3-lap run. They went fast, slow, fast with their drivers. So that's why they were the first car out. Once they'd gone, we thought, well, no one else is going to go. It felt like the rest of them would be doing a single lap run. And that was why we just followed McLaren out, was simply that they were going, no one else was going to go in the intervening time. We went, and then everyone else followed. But it stems from that decision to do the 2 laps. And, on reflection, we didn't actually go for the second lap. Therefore, you're just carrying fuel in the car for no reason. Would we do it again? Probably not.
And also looking then from sprint qualifying into main qualifying, was there a lot of setup changes that needed to happen in regards to the feedback that we looked at?
Well, we did change the car quite a bit. And one of the challenges with a sprint race is you can make the car better, you can make the car worse. You've got the information from that sprint race to see how the tyres were behaving and how the car was handling. You can see how your pace is. And we were struggling, as were most, with too much front degradation. And that was the graining that was damaging, in particular, the front left. The car was getting quite understeery. So the decision was then, well, how much of that do we try and dial out? We were able to put more front end in the car. You can do that mechanically, you can do it aerodynamically, which meant that the life of the front left tyre in particular was a bit easier. And the other thing was, we said, let's actually focus on race pace. Let's not worry too much about qualifying, because in the race in China, you normally find that you end up in race pace order. So we made those changes, and for George, actually, it definitely helped the qualifying pace. He had a really, really strong lap, and it was just that the car was turning a bit better and they were able to carry more speed.
And you mentioned tyre degradation there. One of the questions was the tyre degradation particularly high in the sprint race? And was that down to the track temperatures increasing on that new surface?
Well, it's definitely linked to the new surface. So new surfaces can be quite aggressive for that graining mechanism, and they recently resurfaced the whole track. So you've got fresh tarmac, it's great, it's very grippy, the drivers like it, but you can get this effect where it starts to damage the aspect of the tyre. And when the tyre then has a very wavy surface to it, it can't generate as much grip because it doesn't sit as well on that fresh tarmac. So that was the mechanism for the degradation. It was very bad on Friday in free practice. So we saw it there first time. It was still pretty bad in the sprint race, but with all the rubber going down, it does actually make it a bit easier. And that starts to protect the tyre. On top of the fact that you've got the opportunity to make those changes, by the time we actually got to Sunday, you could see the degradation was a lot lower. People didn't do so long stints on that medium, but if you'd wanted to do a longer stint, you could have done, and the tyres were behaving in a more normal way.
And when a track has been resurfaced like that, do we already know how the cars are going to interact with it, or is it slightly a guessing game and that's when practice sessions are important?
When they make a new tarmac, they're not all the same, but they do tend to behave quite similarly. And you're looking for how smooth it is and, what the stones are like, how many of them are actually exposed. And over the life of a tarmac, it tends to always go in the same direction, where it will become more prone to overheating. One of the oldest tarmacs on the calendar is actually Bahrain now, and that's one of the most overheating prone circuits that there is. So you can make some good assumptions as to how the track is going to behave when it's a brand new tarmac. What's quite difficult though is to really know the intricacies of that, and exactly how bad might the graining effect be. That is in turn impacted by track temperature. But I have to say the simulation work we did ahead of the event was all quite relevant, pretty much on the money. And that meant that we were in a good position going into the race weekend.
So let's get back now to how well George has done to get that second podium in 2 races. What were the differences that happened for his qualifying between Q1, Q2 and Q3 in order for him to be able to put down such an incredible lap?
Well, the key thing with the early sessions is just get yourself through. The difficulty, though, George was having was similar to the one we were having in sprint qualifying, was just knowing exactly how hard to work the tyre on the outlap. And if you don't push it enough, it's cold and it won't grip when you open the lap. You push it too hard and the first sector's good, but then you get overheating. So really with most of it, he was just playing with the outlaps, trying to understand it for himself. We can give him guidance in terms of temperatures and references for previous laps he's done. We can also tell him what other drivers are trying and looking at. But as I said, the lap times looked a bit up and down, certainly didn't look like he was going to be a contender for the front row, but one of the key things in qualifying is get it together when it matters, and that's almost always Q3 run 2, and thankfully George did a great job and put together a brilliant lap.
Definitely got it together, just a fraction of time behind Piastri. And I have to say, with that launch start that he had as well off the line, I can't help but think of the what ifs if he just managed to get it on pole then. And talking of what ifs, what would Kimi's race pace have looked like if he hadn't sustained that damage, and where did it even come from?
Okay, well, when did it occur? What happened was Leclerc had hit Lewis's rear tyre and that broke his front wing end plate off. Now, Kimi saw that, but he couldn't avoid it because there were cars either side of him, so he drove over it, and that then went under the car and it damaged the floor fences, and that was costing quite a lot of performance. Now, how much in terms of lap time? Well, that's a lot easier to say if you had a number of laps before it happened and then you can look at the loss. But here, when it's on lap 1, you're having to estimate a bit where he would have been. But to make that estimation, we can look at the aero data. And we could see that we lost something of the order of 2 to 3 tenths of a second worth of downforce. But then the other problem was it's not evenly distributed across the car. You'd have heard Kimi come on the radio relatively early on and say to Bono, "I've got no rear grip, mate." And what he meant there is that more of the downforce was missing from the rear axle. That causes the rear tyres to slide, they get hot, they lose grip, and he was battling a bit with that through most of the race. And you can tune it a bit at the pit stop, you can make a front wing adjust, but the problem is it can cause quite inconsistent effects when you've got damage on a car. It's not just like having 2 tenths less performance, because in some corners or in some crosswing conditions, it can be more or less, the balance can be moving around a lot. And he did a good job to deal with that. But it was frustrating because I think from the pace we'd seen with Kimi this weekend, he should have been fighting with Ferraris, with Max. It would have been great to see him up there. And it's also great for his learning as an F1 driver to be racing at the front. So a bit of bad luck for Kimi there, but he's really positive and looking forward to the rest of the season.
Yeah, it's going to be great to see him when we come back out for the triple header now. He's been in the rain with Melbourne, a damaged floor, so exciting to see what can happen. And staying with Kimi, how is he fitting within the team now as a Formula One racing driver? Has he taken to that just so well in the first 2 races?
He's a brilliant fit in the team. And it's difficult to come in after a driver who's been as successful as Lewis has. And for Kimi, it's still, really early days in his F1 career. Now, happily, he's got an extremely experienced race engineer with Bono, who's helping him sort of work out how to approach the weekends and you know, how you sort of build your speed and how you work on the car setup. Everyone in the team's quite excited to be working with him, and he's just enjoying it. I think in Melbourne he couldn't quite believe he was actually starting an F1 race. Having your first race being a wet one, well, that's particularly tricky, but he's settling into it, and I think there's a lot more to come from Kimi.
Shov, was it always the plan that we were going to go for a one-stop strategy?
Well, that definitely wasn't the plan. It was a plan, and we thought it might be possible, but on the information we'd seen from the sprint race, it actually seemed the less likely thing. We were more expecting that the race would go to a two-stop. The reason we're not sure, though, is the C2 tyre, so that's the second hardest compound. Well, that was the hard tyre in Shanghai, and we've got very little information on that. We did run it in Bahrain, but Bahrain's a very different circuit and a very different tarmac. So what we didn't know, and what none of the teams knew, was how would that tyre hold up. And early on in the life you could see there was degradation, but then that settled down, and it was when we spotted that degradation slow, and then suddenly the drivers were doing green lap times, you know, they were doing their quickest laps of the race so far. That was one of the things that told you that the one stop might be on. So it's not that you're really betting it's one or the other. It's more that you're looking for what are the clues and the cues that are going to tell you you don't want to come in for a second set, you just want to go to the finish.
In those moments as well, would you listen to driver feedback in that particular moment, or are you looking at data and following the best strategy plan?
Well, you're really doing all of it. The drivers are actually really good at telling us what they can feel from the tyres, and you know, we've had it before where George has told us that they're stabilising, and we've actually changed our plans, or you certainly lean more towards the one stop. Now we're communicating with them the whole way through, and with George it was very much at the point where we were saying this is starting to look like it's going to a one, that he's saying yeah, the tyres feel like they'll handle that. We can also estimate how much rubber is remaining using some models that we've got, and again those were starting to indicate that we'd have the rubber to get to the end of the race. So it's really using all of those tools to try and make the right decision.
And back to acknowledging what a fantastic start to the season we've had, very exciting going forwards. What are our expectations now as we come to the first triple header starting in Japan?
Well, you know, we've shown that we've got a car that works well over a range of circuits. What we've also seen, though, is that McLaren are probably the team to beat. Max is pretty quick. Ferrari certainly don't look like they're far behind, and they've had a bit of bad luck in the last few races. So it's a pretty tight fight at the front. We're working hard to try and bring development to the car because, as I said, we think that we need to close that gap to McLaren in particular, but we've got three very exciting circuits. So Suzuka, that's a fantastic track, very flowing, very fast. A lot of drivers have that as their favourite on the calendar. First time for Kimi though, and that's quite a tall order for such a young driver to be going there on their third race, but he's excited to drive that. Then on to Bahrain. Well, we know Bahrain because we've been testing there. It has its own challenges, but hopefully we'll be at least in the fight for podiums. And then Saudi Arabia, well, that's a street track, quite smooth, again, a relatively new tarmac, and that throws up its own challenges. So three very different circuits, and by the time we've done five, we'll probably get some idea as to the real order. But as I said, it's just exciting to start a season with a car that's working well, that the drivers are enjoying driving. It's much more predictable, and we're looking forward to the remainder.